With the expansion of English control and O'Neill's position weakening, the Irish would need aid now more than ever, and that aid would come from the world's strongest power at the time, the Spanish. Throughout the war, the Spanish had been providing weapons, money and advisors to the Irish. This was advantageous to the Spanish, as they had been fighting a war with England. In 1596, an armada was sent to Ireland by King Philip II of Spain. However, before it left Spanish waters, a storm struck the fleet. Nearly 5,000 men died and 38 ships were lost. King Philip then sent another armada in 1597, but this too failed due to a storm. Finally, in late 1601, the Spanish armada would arrive in Ireland to support the Irish forces. But a storm once again hit, and 9 of them, with the majority of the veteran soldiers and gunpowder, had to turn back. Most of the remaining forces landed at Kinsale and fortified themselves in the walled town, as well as 2 forts nearby. The Spanish landing at Kinsale provided some breathing room for O'Neill, as the English had to muster their forces to contain the threat. However, they landed on the complete opposite end of the island, making them isolated from the main Irish forces. The Spanish may have chosen Kinsale, as it was a well-known harbour to them. It was often used by ships from Spain and Portugal. They also may have feared landing in the north, as in 1588 they famously shipwrecked in a storm along the west coast of Ireland. Mountjoy rushed to Kinsale with as many men as he could muster, weakening the defences of the Pale in the process. The English arrived in Kinsale on the 2nd of October with a force of 12,000 men. They seized some higher ground and subjected the Spanish forces to constant artillery fire. The artillery resulted in the capture of the forts, allowing the English navy to enter the bay with a squadron of 10 ships. O'Neill and O'Donnell were hesitant about marching south, as it would leave Ulster vulnerable. They hesitated for weeks as autumn turned into a particularly wet and stormy winter. The besieged Spanish garrison began to suffer from the lack of supplies, and O'Neill was forced to go to their aid. He understood that if the Spanish suffered defeat in Kinsale, he would be unlikely to receive further military help from Spain. They set out on a 300-mile winter march separately to ease supply. On his march south, O'Neill destroyed parts of the Pale in an effort to force Mountjoy away from Kinsale. But Mountjoy saw this as a diversion and held his ground. He understood that everything hinged on Kinsale. If we win here, the rest will be ours, and if we lose, the rest will all be his. Marching south, O'Neill encountered Irish lords that had turned to the English and intimidated them into supporting his cause. Finally, after a long march, O'Neill met with O'Donnell north of Kinsale on the 21st of December. They were joined by additional forces from Leinster and Munster, as well as the Spanish that had landed at Castlehaven. O'Neill successfully cut the English supply lines from Cork, and by December, the shortage of supplies and freezing temperatures had begun to take a toll on the English, with many dying of dysentery and fever. With this in mind, many have wondered what caused O'Neill and his forces to initiate an offensive when they could have simply waited, as the English were losing men every night to the cold and sickness. Some have theorised that pressure from the besieged Spanish forced O'Neill's hand. Others have suggested that Red Hugh O'Donnell persuaded him to attack. And so, early morning on Christmas Eve 1601, the Irish forces moved on the English. The Irish marched to the ridgeline of Ardmartin, overlooking the English encampment. The English scouts had been made aware of these movements when they observed the lit matches of the Irish in the darkness. The apparent plan was for the Irish and Spanish to move on the English simultaneously, but as O'Neill moved on the English, the Spanish never joined them. Mountjoy, being made aware of the Irish advance, organised his troops to defend the main and lesser camps. However, the situation was dire for the English, as desertion, sickness and casualties had reduced the besieging army by nearly 50%. The severely depleted cavalry of approximately 400 horse had been sent under the command of Sir Richard Wingfield. Advancing towards Ardmartin, Wingfield observed the Irish approaching the Earl of Thomond's camp. Mountjoy called upon the reserves of the camp to support Wingfield. O'Neill, noting the advance of the English, called a halt and ordered his forces to fall back on Ardmartin towards the Millwater River. Wingfield, having gained the summit of Ardmartin, could see that the Irish had retired directly down the hill and across a ford, having passed a boggy area onto solid ground. O'Neill's likely intention was that the boggy ground would offer protection against the English horse and funnel the English across the ford. Wingfield took 100 men and 100 horse to engage the Irish skirmishers. They managed to force the Irish to fall back on their main battle. Now, on solid ground with the Millwater between them, O'Neill waited for Mountjoy's next move. The Irish forces abandoned their typical formations they had been using throughout the war, which focused more on smaller units that had more flexibility. The Irish instead arranged themselves into tercio formation, possibly due to Spanish influence. O'Neill's troops had never fought in this way and were untrained to fight in large formations. Meanwhile, the English were also reorganising their forces and were getting ready to move on O'Neill. The English horse was able to splash across the ford and outflank the main Irish battle line. The sight of the English horse to their right caused the Irish skirmishers to fall back on their main battle, abandoning the ford and allowing the observant Mountjoy to push more troops across. The English horse immediately charged the Irish, but the tercio formation was able to stand firm and the pikes repulsed the horsemen who fell back. Thinking the English horse to be retreating, O'Neill called upon his light horse from reserve to exploit the supposed retreat. The Irish galloped forward in pursuit, but by this time the disciplined English horse had reformed and presented a solid front to their lighter mounted Irish opponents. A volley of shot also came in from Power's regiment as they crossed the stream, unhorsing a few Irish riders, causing them to break and flee straight back into O'Neill's main battle, disorganising it and causing part of it to flee. Seeing their opportunity, the English horse led by Wingfield charged into the disorganised Irish battle and caused a total rout of O'Neill's men, who were pursued without mercy by the cavalry. With the rout of O'Neill's main force, Mountjoy sent word to St John's regiment to advance with his men across the bog and charge the flank of Tyrrell's squadron. After seeing the charge on O'Neill's force and receiving fire from St John's skirmishers, Tyrrell's men began to flee on foot. The Irish began to outpace their more heavily equipped Spanish allies, who upon finding themselves abandoned, closed ranks and retreated to a small hill. They were then set upon by a troop of horse led by Sir William Godolphin. The Spanish presented their pikes and resisted fiercely, but were overwhelmed and hacked to pieces. 40 men were captured unhurt, with up to 70 men killed. O'Donnell's rearguard for some reason arrived late to the battle, and upon seeing the rout of O'Neill, fell back along with the rest of the forces. With O'Neill's forces returning to Ulster, the English resumed their encirclement of Kinsale. De la Guilla saw his position as hopeless without effective action from the Irish lords. The Spanish, who had lost many men in the siege, gave up the town to Mountjoy and were allowed to sail back to Spain. The casualties for the Irish were estimated to be around 1,200 killed and wounded, along with 100 Spanish. The casualties for the English were estimated to be around 6,000, mainly due to disease and poor weather. As O'Neill returned to Ulster, many of the Irish lords that supported him on the way south began to attack his forces, as they did not want to be on the losing side. This, combined with the poor weather conditions, meant that O'Neill lost many men on the march north, possibly around 3,000, twice as many lost on the battlefield in Kinsale. With the defeat in Kinsale and Niall Garve O'Donnell having taken control of Donegal Castle and Ballyshannon, Red Hugh O'Donnell announced his plan to travel to Spain to seek further support from the Spanish. This demoralised his supporters, despite O'Donnell's vow he would return by the next spring with 20,000 Spanish soldiers. Tibbet Kidda Burke, the chieftain of the Mayo Burkes, also departed alongside O'Donnell during this period. Throughout the 9 Years' War, Mayo witnessed many internal conflicts among the Gaelic lords, and following Kidda's departure, it fell under English control by 1602. Sailing from Castlehaven on the 6th of January 1602, O'Donnell landed at Corunna in Galicia, where many of the other Irish chiefs had already arrived as refugees. A year passed and O'Donnell did not receive any news from King Philip III of Spain. He would eventually die soon after. With Red Hugh's death, Spanish plans to send further assistance to the Irish clans were abandoned. The Anglo-Irish double agent James Spanish Blake is alleged to have poisoned O'Donnell. In a letter to Lord Mountjoy, Carey reported that one James Blake took a solemn oath to do service and has gone into Spain with a determination to kill O'Donnell. And in another letter, O'Donnell is dead, he is poisoned by James Blake, of whom your lordship hath been formerly acquainted. It is however unlikely that he was poisoned. A more probable cause of death was the tapeworm that the documents at the time stated to be the cause of his demise. Spies would often make improbable claims for their actions, and it seems very likely that Carew exaggerated the success of his actions. By 1602, with O'Neill's reputation and military strength shattered, his remaining allies started to waver, but the war was not over yet. In an effort to bring about the surrender of O'Neill's allies, Mountjoy continued his scorched earth tactics on Ulster, which were especially brutal to the civilian population. But in spite of this, O'Neill's remaining allies did not surrender. As Mountjoy approached Dungannon, O'Neill decided to abandon the town and gave orders to burn it, retreating into the Glen Concane woods. Mountjoy then occupied the ruins of Dungannon. To the surprise of the English, as they entered the heart of Ulster, they found that the famine was already underway. This was not a direct result of their scorched earth tactics, but one brought about by the Ulster war efforts. The English didn't expect their scorched earth tactics to bring about a famine until much later. As a result of this already existing famine, as well as the burning of the crops by the English, an even more severe famine then swept across Ulster, resulting in the deaths of 60,000 people. By 1603, most of O'Neill's allies had surrendered, and O'Neill was considered a fugitive as he continued to elude English capture. The English desperately needed to bring the war to an end, as they had spent an enormous amount of money and could no longer afford to continue it. It's estimated that the English spent around £2 million on the war. With the cost of the war bringing England close to bankruptcy, Queen Elizabeth I dropped her insistence on unconditional surrender and authorised Mountjoy to treat with O'Neill upon honourable terms. O'Neill was assured he could travel under safe conduct and began negotiations at Mellifont near Drogheda. Mountjoy purposefully withheld the information that Queen Elizabeth had died a few days prior, and that James VI of Scotland would likely become her successor. O'Neill couldn't be accused of being a traitor to James VI. O'Neill had also received help from Scotland throughout the war, making it crucial for Mountjoy to keep the Queen's passing to himself. O'Neill surrendered, swearing loyalty to the English crown, and was allowed to keep most of his lands. Although the war had effectively ended with the signing of this treaty, its final battles were fought during the English invasion of West Breffni in April 1603, which remained the sole holdout Irish kingdom. The kingdom was ruled by Brian O'Rourke, one of the Alliance's chief lieutenants. He failed to secure any concessions from the treaty, as his half-brother Tig O'Rourke had fought with the English during the war, and he was granted the lordship of West Breffni in return. Following a 12-day siege, a force of 3,000 men, led by Tig, Henry Folliot, and Rory O'Donnell, eventually brought the area, and thus all of Ireland, under English control on the 25th of April, 1603.